Welcome everyone to the session on governance, accountability, and support systems. I'm Julie Marsh. I'm a professor at USC and also the faculty director at USC for PACE. We're very excited to have an incredible panel today of folks who will be presenting. Jacob Hibel is from the University of California at Davis. Morgan Polikoff is at USC, Rossier School of Education. Eos Trinidad is at UC Berkeley School of Education. And Jason Willis, who is from the University of the Pacific. I thought as context for this session, I would just remind us that under the local control funding formula in 2013, there was a real shift to this notion of localized educational governance. And that LCFF extended far beyond just a funding mechanism, but also included key initiatives at promoting continuous improvement and accountability. And that included the LCAP, or the Local Control Accountability Plan, the statewide system of support, and the California School Dashboard. All were intended to help empower local and regional entities in educational governance. And this, of course, intersects with a lot of existing tools and data sources that we've had in the state, other data systems, the school accountability report cards, and of course it engages a whole range of folks from the state level down through regional bodies, also the CCEE, school districts and counties and their boards. And so in this panel, we're going to be examining all of this in various ways and digging pretty deep into these topics. So as the moderator, I also get to be a presenter of one of the papers that I was a part of, which was a report on school boards in California. And this undertook, it was a big effort with a lot of folks on a team across multiple universities. And one of my co-authors, Jamie Estrada, is here somewhere, but I want to shout out to Jamie and as all of these other folks. Okay. So we started from a place of understanding that school boards were really, and schools and school districts were experiencing what we would call rapidly changing contexts, politics, social innovations, technology, and whatnot, including the notion that politics of education is becoming more nationalized, that we're seeing polarization, we're seeing decreases in trust in public institutions, and all the like. And we wanted to move past the sort of sensationalized depictions of this and the dysfunctions that we were seeing on the news to really understand how school board members themselves were experiencing these realities. And we felt this was particularly important in a state like California that, as I said, has really doubled down on the notion of local control. So our questions were, what are the characteristics of school boards and school board members? How are they experiencing and negotiating this rapidly changing context? How are they engaging their communities? And how are they using data, were some of our questions, with ultimately the intent of understanding what might be some implications for how we could better support and improve our boards. This was a qualitative mixed methods study. We started, even before getting down to facts, with a pilot study that we had done following carefully 10 school board members. We used those results to then inform a statewide survey that we conducted online. We sent it out to a near census of board members in the state, and we obtained a 17.5% response rate that we are very proud of. It may not sound like a lot to a lot of you, but this is actually a huge endeavor to get that many folks, 801 individuals, and it's more than the 10% response rate that's generally typical for school board surveys nationwide. We then followed up with some interviews with 3 groups of folks on 3 topics that emerged from our survey as important. One was the changing federal policy landscape and how that was affecting them. The second was around state-local relations, and the third was about their intent to run for re-election. I'm not going to be able to get into all of that right now in my 8 minutes, but there's deep dives that we do, and I encourage you to look at our report and get into the rich qualitative data that we present there. So in terms of our survey, we received 801 responses, which represented 478 school districts, which was a little bit more than half of the districts in the state. We looked at the differences between them, and you can't probably see that in the back, but they were generally representative of the full universe of school districts, and then we did do some weighting to account for some of the differences that we saw there. Okay, so what do they look like? Well, school board members are more highly educated than the general public. Fully 80% had at least a college degree. That compares to roughly 38% of residents in the state as a whole. They had higher levels of income. They were mostly white, slightly majority were female, and most were parents. And this tracks with some of the research we know nationally in terms of school board members and their characteristics. We asked about a set of responsibilities, wanted to get a sense of how they see their roles, and it generally aligns with prior research and what the major associations would say are the actual roles of a school board, right? Which is among the most important, they said, was hiring and evaluating the superintendent, fiscal oversight, and monitoring, setting state sort of district level goals and monitoring that. They generally reported very positive operations on their boards, that their board was leveraging knowledge and expertise of each member, that the board members, the agendas and discussions aligned with the district vision, and that they were effectively using their time in meetings. And in the report, we go into a lot of other positive perceptions of relationships with stakeholders and other conditions in their boards. So fairly positive in a lot of these items, yet they were reporting challenges. So as you can see here, almost half felt that the job was more politically challenging than they had anticipated. 38% said that they had conflict with other board members in their boards, and that about 30% experienced derogatory comments on social media. And these were particularly true for certain groups: women, members of districts with trustee area elections, and members in the cities. And so the members in cities are the blue dot on the right. The yellow is the town, the red are suburban, and the gray are rural. And as you can see on all of those, folks from the city were more likely to report political challenges. Again, this kind of nuance we have throughout the report, and it's really important that you take a look at that report because the experiences of board members vary greatly by their district context and by their own individual characteristics. And so again, I can't say that any of this is in the aggregate true for everyone across the state. Okay, so the sources of conflict generally were shifts in federal policy around funding, immigration policies, for example, enduring challenges around declining enrollment and labor issues, and less so around the culture war issues, such as teaching of race, transgender issues around bathrooms and sports and the like. And so again, we would dive real deeply into our interview data around, for example, the federal stuff and the immigration and how those policies are really shaping their work on their boards. Okay, we wanted to understand more about the data that they were using and what they were using to set priorities. They valued all forms of data, but generally favored feedback from principals and teachers and parents more so than the formal sort of test data, the LCAP, and the dashboard, which I know we'll return to in some of these other presentations. And part of that might be due to the lack of confidence. So we asked them about a number of things. They were very confident in their ability to build relationships, evaluate the superintendent, run meetings, but they were less confident in things like navigating conflict and political tension, and in using data and evaluating curriculum and program effectiveness. And when we asked them about their training, they also really wanted more training around data. So we asked them, did you receive training? Did you not? And then regardless, would you want more? And so that's what the blue lines the blue parts are showing you. And overall, many of them wanted more support, not just in navigating all the legal challenges and guidance around shifting policy, but around evaluating the effectiveness of programs and interpreting and using data. So a big appetite there for more support. When we asked them about how they're engaging their constituents, they valued the input of the community, but they were struggling to obtain a broad representative group of folks engaged with them at the local level. And then finally, we wanted to understand their future intent. And you can see here on the right, only half said that they were probably or definitely going to seek another term. And even fewer on the left said that they wanted to run for higher office. And though this isn't depicted in the slide, we also know that there aren't as many people jumping at the chance to become a board member. 38% of the board members in our survey had run unopposed, and 7% had been appointed to their current position. So almost half had not faced any kind of contested race. And so for us, this raises a number of things collectively, a lot of bright spots. Our research also indicates some opportunities for us to strengthen our system of school boards. One is around the electoral issues I mentioned, and we think there might be some better thinking that we could all do collectively around how to strengthen and diversify the pipeline, how to think about making the job maybe more manageable and attractive to folks, particularly underrepresented community members. We think there's a lot to be learned around how we might better support and think about differentiated professional learning opportunities and networking opportunities that they showed an appetite for, particularly around areas such as data use and navigating the politics of the moment. We think that there's some direction in increasing public awareness around the position of the board and their responsibilities, and also guidance that could be provided to district leaders on how to engage the community. And finally, we suggest that there still is a critical ongoing role for the state in facilitating this vision of local control, ensuring that local board members can in fact govern in the face of these complex challenges facing our districts. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to, who's next? Jacob Hibel. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Hibel. The technical report that I'll be presenting some findings from today is one that I co-authored with Xander Bieberman, who is a data scientist and software engineer at Scale. Our technical report was a little different from some of the others in that it kind of had dual objectives. On the one hand, we were focused on developing some research infrastructure, new tools for analyzing data from LCAPs at scale across the state. And then the second half is doing some initial analysis, some descriptive analysis of what the contents of LCAPs look like in the current academic year. So LCAPs, this is actually probably the rare room where I'm speaking to people who have seen an LCAP before. Have you, like show of hands, has anyone ever seen an LCAP? Oh, I could see it in your eyes. They are, one way, a diplomatic way to say, information-dense documents that detail LEAs, so school districts, County Office of Education and charter schools, planning, budgeting, community engagement, accountability processes, a lot of financial information. There's a ton of really fascinating and important data contained in LCAPs, but those data have been essentially kind of locked in for purely technical reasons. The LCAP is presented as a PDF document, and computational tools, existing algorithmic tools for reading and extracting data from PDFs are sort of not up to the task of dealing with these really complex document structures. They have trouble reading the tables and pulling information out in a way where it can all be sort of synthesized and linked together. So what Xander designed was a four-step process that leverages new large language models to, without going into like a lot of technical detail, you sort of teach an AI model what an LCAP should look like and how the information is stored in the LCAP. You sort of teach it the framework. Then we do several passes through a couple of different large language models to read the LCAPs and create a new document in JSON format that preserves all of the structure of the PDF. So the tables are kind of replicated in a machine readable format. And then once we have the LCAP data put into a format that is available for analysis, the LCAP is sort of unlocked. And now we can ask a lot of the questions that have been percolating since the advent of LCFF. So what we did is take all of the LCAPs that were submitted in the 2024-25 academic year. Of those, 2,192 were actual LCAPs. A lot of documents that get submitted as LCAPs aren't. There are other sorts of documents, or they're empty, don't contain any content. But for the most part, we had LCAPs from 864 districts, 58 county offices, and over 1,200 charter schools. We processed those LCAPs using the pipeline that Xander developed. And when it came time to analyze those data, what I wanted to focus on was the piece of the LCAP. So I've been working with LCAPs for a decade or so now. And the piece that has always been the most difficult to work with is the goals and actions section. So it's where the LEA says, here's what our goals are for the coming academic year. Here are the actions we plan to take in pursuit of those goals. That information is nested in very long, sort of complex tables that have been essentially impossible to work with. So we set the bar high and wanted to see what's in those goals. What are our LEAs doing? What are their goals? How do they plan to achieve them? Before I get to this finding about the goal duplication, let me say, so the initial step was to categorize those goals and themes. We use natural language processing procedures, computational text analysis methods that have been used for analyzing lots of other sorts of text. When initially processing and analyzing the data, the models were having a hard time because they assume, those analytic models assume that each of the texts is independent and distinct. And what kept coming out of the results was I was finding these themes and topics that were really just identifying LCAPs as coming from a particular county or from a particular charter network. And the reason for that is that a large proportion of the goals and actions in the LCAPs were copy and pasted, sort of duplicated across districts, and in particular within charter school networks. This seems to be one of the findings that I'm getting the most questions about, that people are most interested in. So here, several of the largest charter networks had pretty high levels of goal duplication. What that means is every charter school in the network submitted exactly the same goals and exactly the same actions. But the same was also true in some of our counties and traditional school districts. One of the questions that raises is if our local control funding formula and the local control and accountability plan is intended to be truly local and to reflect the needs of local districts and individual schools, whether that's being achieved through the LCAP, if schools across the state that belong to the same charter network or every school in the county articulates exactly the same goals and actions. Another piece of our analysis looked at, in some ways, the measurability of these goals. So when LEAs are writing their LCAP goals, are they writing them in a way when they can, such that they could evaluate whether their goals are being met or whether they have explicit measurable targets? Throughout the analysis, we also sort of stratified the sample or looked at how LCAP content varies according to things like urbanicity and district size, characteristics of student body composition, and so forth. Details for all of these findings are in the technical report that I also encourage folks to look at. So in terms of looking at what districts are writing about, what their goals are, the best fitting model identified 25 different themes in these goals. The most prevalent themes were safe and secure learning environment. That was the top goal, or the top sort of type of goal or theme. Districts also emphasize community partnerships, college and career readiness, and then various aspects of community and parent engagement, along with rigorous curriculum. In terms of the actions, we performed a second analysis looking at what types of actions districts or LEAs intend to employ in pursuit of those goals. The far and away sort of the most prominent type of action was one oriented around extracurricular activities and enrichment. Staffing and hiring, student support services were also predominant themes. I won't walk you through this. Mostly I'm proud of how pretty this one looks, and so I wanted to have it in my slide deck. But here we're linking actions and goals. So by type of goal, what's the most sort of predominant type of action that districts articulate as their method for pursuing that goal. This is walked through in greater detail in the report as well. The analysis piece was really a sort of proof of concept. So once we can unlock the LCAP for analysis, what sorts of questions can we ask? These are mostly descriptive questions in the report, but there are some, I think, very interesting future directions. I would actually like to take this opportunity to ask you all in the room, if you had all the LCAPs and could ask questions about what is in the LCAPs, how do they vary across the state, how do they change over time, what are the questions that would be most interesting and perhaps important to you all. Maybe you can think about that for a little bit and come talk to me at our next break, because there are sort of infinite directions this might go. These are some of the directions that we're currently pursuing, but there may be other things that come to mind for you all as well. It's an exciting time. I'm very pleased to have been asked to participate in this project, and very excited to continue doing research on these local control and accountability plans. Thanks.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Morgan Polikoff. I'm a professor at USC, and I'm going to talk to you about public accountability in California, the dashboard, and the SARCs, the School Accountability Report Cards. I did this work with my former student and current researcher, Shira Hatterline, who's at Arizona State University. So briefly, what is public accountability? Well, we've had this transition where we went from the No Child Left Behind era, which a lot of people think of as being sort of heavy on the consequential forms of accountability, where school performance was tied to specific, policy responses, whether it's school closures or turnarounds or things like that. And arguably, there's less emphasis on consequential accountability these days, and I would say especially in California as compared to some other states, and a greater emphasis on transparency and the public reporting of performance information. And so when we use the term public accountability, we're referring to systems that make school performance data transparent and accessible to stakeholders, often through accountability tools like dashboards or report cards. And so in California, the two most prominent such systems are the California School Dashboards and the School Accountability Report Cards. Hopefully, most folks in the room have seen some of these, because I'm not going to show you any pictures of them, just for the sake of time. So I actually wrote about the dashboard for Getting Down to Facts 2, and so there have been some changes in the dashboard since Getting Down to Facts 2, including the adoption of some dashboard principles, the operational reporting of student achievement growth, which is an unbelievable, I can't believe this finally happened. Folks have been asking for this forever, although it's still quite buried, and I have many critiques of how the state is handling student achievement growth. Expansion of indicators in student groups, including reporting on science and long-term English learners, and the ongoing refinement of supporting resources on the dashboard. So we wanted to take stock again, as we did 8 years ago, of both the dashboard and also the SARCs. And so we start by saying, okay, well, what do we know or think we know about effective public accountability tools based on the literature? And how do California's tools, including the dashboard and the SARCs, compare to best practices and what we can see in other states? So we did a little targeted literature scan and then a content analysis, and we also drew, for one item, on data from these Getting Down to Facts surveys and interviews with California district leaders. And the literature scan drew on reports from organizations including Education Trust, the Center on Reinventing Public Education, a report that I wrote, the Data Quality Campaign, an organization that I chair the board of, and the Council of Chief State School Officers. So based on this review, we identified 6 principles that I'm not going to read to you right now, but I'll go through them one at a time and talk to you about how the dashboard and the SARC stack up against them. So, and then I should say, and ultimately what we do is we rate California on a scale of does not meet standards, partially meet standards, or meet standards on each of these 6 principles. So first, we look at whether these public accountability systems are anchored in a theory of action and priority users. And here we argue that the dashboard doesn't really meet standards. These tools don't really have distinct audiences, or they seem to conflate distinct audiences and lack a theory of action. So for instance, the dashboard states that its purpose is to, quote, provide parents and educators with meaningful information on school and district progress so they can participate in decisions to improve learning. And the landing page for the SARCs describes their intent as providing, quote, information to the community to allow public comparison of schools for student achievement, environment, resources, and demographics. And we don't really think that either of those systems actually is set up to accomplish the things that they say that they are. And just the mere fact of the coexistence of the two portals is quite confusing to people, like which one should you go to answer a particular question. Second, in terms of using valid, reliable, and holistic indicators, here we think the dashboard and the SARCs partially meet standards, so we appreciate that there's an array of measures beyond just student test scores, but the dashboard continues to emphasize status over student achievement growth. It's one of only 3 states that really substantially downplays growth. Yes, the growth data are now available in the dashboard. You can go see them, but they're buried all the way at the bottom, and they're not used at all in the color rankings. Similarly, the college and career indicator is relatively superficial on the career side. We talk in more detail in the report about what we mean by all these things. it doesn't really fully capture the existing landscape of industry recognized credentials, certificates, and occupational licenses. Third, in terms of centering equity, making every student group visible, we again say partially meet standards. So we do think that the dashboard and the SARCs go beyond federal minimums to report student subgroup performance, but results are somewhat hard to find rather than prominently displayed. I'll show you in a moment what I mean by that. And because California uses an N size of 30, there's more data suppression than is typical in a lot of other states because the recommendation of national organizations is an N size of 10, meaning that you will report on student groups if there's 10 students of that characteristic. So just an example on the dashboard, to find the student group data, you have to go here to the bottom. So you get an overall report, but then you would have to click on View More Details in order to see how each individual group would report. And in a lot of other states, student subgroup performance is displayed much more prominently in a way that allows you to compare. Fourth, in terms of showing trends and enabling fair comparisons, we argue that the dashboard and the SARCs do not meet standards. There's really no option to compare schools. There's no compare tool. There's really no option to compare data longitudinally to look at trends, and there's really limited explanation of changing indicators. And there's lots of examples of other states' tools that do some of these things. So for instance, if you want to look at longitudinal data, many states have displays like this, but this is from Oklahoma, which shows you the performance of a particular school over time, or this is from Nebraska, which allows you to compare a school to other nearby schools or similar schools with similar demographics. In terms of designing for usability and coherence, again, we argue that that the state's tools do not meet standards because there's really unclear relationships between the tools, because the dashboard gauge indicator is, I think, a little bit confusing to lots of folks, and there's no summative rating available on either tool, which is a conscious decision, and we could argue about whether there should or should not be a summative rating, but lots of other states have them, and we think even if you don't want a summative rating, this example from Illinois shows how data are put together in a way that's a little bit more comprehensible, we think, than the dashboard. And finally, in terms of making results actionable, again, we say that these tools do not meet standards. So there's limited connection of the dashboard and the SARCs to interventions or to the LCAP processes. And just 19 of the 94 folks who are interviewed in the district leader interviews report that the dashboard is a major driver of priorities. So even at that level, it doesn't seem to be widely used. And the data are not really easily manipulable by key potential users. So to conclude our report, I encourage you to take a look. We recommend a set of near-term, medium-term, and long-term recommendations, which I won't read to you, but they include things that are relatively simple, like just taking the existing tools and making them more usable by providing clear operational definitions. Then things that would go a little bit farther, like clarifying the primary audience and maybe offering differentiated tools depending on who the potential users were. And then finally, maybe a more serious rethinking of, the sort of theory of change for public accountability in California and whether it's really working as intended. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Trinidad, and I'm excited to be presenting this work on re-envisioning California's county offices of education. So some fast facts about California county offices of education. First, there are 58 county offices of education in between the state and almost 1,000 school districts. 7 serve one district, and LA, County Office of Education, serves the most with 79 districts. You have 53 elected and 5 appointed superintendents. And here are some core functions of the county offices of education. So they're in charge of fiscal oversight and accountability. They're in charge of systems of support, particularly the differentiated assistance. They're also in charge of the educational services, providing court schools and community schools. And provide services, shared services like professional development, human resources, HR, payroll, and other technology needs of districts. In terms of funding, it's funded through the state. They get additional funding through differentiated assistance, through federal and state grants, and also through service contracts. And with these things, really we are interested in a couple of questions. 2 in particular that stood out for us in this report would be, how do COEs function in this system? And also, what opportunities and challenges are present right now? In order to do this, we relied on qualitative interviews, 94 district leaders, 11 county superintendents, and 8 California policy experts. We did quantitative budget analysis, looking at the tax revenues, expenses, and the population within these county offices of education. We looked at geospatial mapping, where we visualize the geographic distribution of expenses and the number of nonprofits in different counties. And we did document analysis, looking at the California Education Code and other legislative analyst reports that were done before. And so the findings are going to be divided into 3 big parts. First is understanding the many important roles of the county offices of education. Second is understanding the sources of variability of these COEs. And then finally, looking at the complex financial dynamics and the incentives that come in there. So one of the things we have to think about when we think about the roles of county offices of education is that there's a long history to this, and that what we see now as happening in county offices is really a lot of things being piled on to county offices of education. So here we have the county offices of education, and I'd argue that there are 2 big functions of county offices of education. On the one hand, you have accountability and oversight, and on the other hand, you have service provision. And what sorts of things are under each one? In terms of accountability and oversight, you have fiscal account oversight. You also have academic oversight with the LCAP. And then this weird thing in the middle of both, which is differentiated assistance, which is on the one hand, you can think of as an oversight or accountability measure, but also a service that's provided to districts. And then you have alternative education services that are provided. Here are examples: juvenile court schools, community schools for expelled students, and some county offices of education function as the administrative unit for the CELPAs. And then you have state and federal grants, and also shared services and fee for services. And so you see here a lot of different functions being provided by county offices of education and become core responsibilities of county offices of education. So how do we make sense of this? I argue that we can think of this in terms of these 2 parts, where you have this hybrid function that they have, both as service providers and state oversight agents. And then you have on the intermediary part that they're on the one hand in charge of top-down implementation, but also bottom-up improvement. And so here are different examples of tasks that fall under each one. And this becomes quite important for both instructional coherence and systems change. California is actually quite unique in this way, because in other states, most other places, like the BOCES in New York State, so the Boards of Cooperative Educational Services, the closest we have, or the closest they have to a county office of education, or Texas Education Service Centers, often just focus on service. And they have a different agency, a government agency, that's focused on oversight and accountability. And so that's me presenting to you what we know about the facts in terms of the many important roles of county offices of education. Next, we also talk about the variability in terms of the support that county offices of education are able to provide. So how do the county offices of education actually vary? Some obvious variations, of course, is in terms of population. You have Alpine with just 500 students, and LA with more than 1 million students. You have geography, scope, and needs of these that are also different. Now, in terms of the supports county offices are able to provide, we see that 85% of districts noted their county offices were helpful. And we see that they're most helpful because they understand the local context, but also that sometimes the materials that are provided could be hits or misses. And so what actually affects variation? We highlight 4 things that affect variation. One is in terms of task alignment. In particular, we talk about the ability of counties to support districts' needs. And so we have counties that are able to hyper-focus and support district needs, and counties that don't. The next is the agency capacity, both the capacity of the county and the capacity of districts to welcome these counties. On the one hand, we have counties that are helpful in providing different approaches, and also counties themselves recognizing that they don't have their expertise. One of the things that was surprising for us was this idea of initiative fatigue, where districts say that even if you're paying for it, we don't want it because we're just navigating through so many changes. And then finally, two other things that affect variation. One is spatial proximity, so the physical closeness of different districts into county offices of education, and then relational proximity, that individuals in the district have close ties with people in the county office. And so here we have this presentation that I showed you earlier, this framework, and we add that this is affected by task alignment, agency capacity, and spatial and relational proximity. Finally, we have the complex financial dynamics and incentives that are there. So where is funding coming from? Here we see that there's operational funding through local property taxes. We have the operations grants. We have alternative education. And one that's surprising is that there's still hold harmless funding even 10 years after the introduction of LCFF. They also have state and federal grants, which can create competition and coordination for different grants. They have differentiated assistance supports, which can be more reactive as counties get more dollars for districts being in DA. And then fee-for-service contracts and special education funding. And so the report details more about these dynamics, case analyses of 5 different counties, and the complexities of this funding. And so to really get down to facts, we really highlight these 3 things about the roles, the variability, and the financial dynamics in the counties, and I'm really looking forward to conversations in a bit. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Really? Come on, y'all. Good morning. I came in this morning just like so much good energy. When I came, I was telling some folks earlier, but let's get to it, keep that energy moving. So I'm Jason Willis. I work both at WestEd, but also professor at University of the Pacific at the McGeorge School of Law. I have 2 studies that I've kind of pushed together that I worked on with getting down to facts. This is the first one with Sean Tanner at WestEd. So brilliant quant methodologist there, and a second that I worked on with Susanna around issues of compliance. So before I dive too far in, just a shout out and appreciation to Humboldt County Office of Ed and the so many districts and charters there that like took a risk with me when I asked them this like crazy question, particularly around compliance and LCAP issues. They were just instrumental in helping to shape some of the early instrument design. And also a huge shout out to CASBO, AXA, and County SUPS for helping with the massive collection of data across both of these efforts. One of the things that I've experienced in my kind of 2 decades here in California is this kind of like emergent policy to practice pattern. And so what I've seen happen is, you know, we will come up with a policy here in Sacramento. Everyone gets really excited about it, like really excited about it. And then 3 or 4 years later, when you go to talk with districts or administrators, superintendents, CFOs, there's almost this like waning spirit, like it's like kind of lost its will. And you see it kind of show up in ways that like we're filing reports or we're submitting data. And I've always been intrigued by like, why is that something that happens? So in a way, you might think about this as like the original policy intent, experiencing like a system change atrophy. And some of the things I'm going to talk about today maybe speak to the reasons that that is happening. So overall, when we think about the kind of walkaways with these 2 studies, the biggest thing is just a lot of duplication. This has come from siloing of initiatives, the way that those laws and regulations and funding basically find their way into the system itself, and they show up in local systems in a way that they're not talking to one another. We hear and see this all the time. in local education agencies, both actors inside that are really frustrated with this, but also those important community members and other actors externally. And when we say stronger accountability in the context of the work that we did here with these two studies, I think it's really important that accountability in the definition that we hold today is what we mean is not more of that. We don't mean more reports. We don't mean more data. It is truly a better alignment between the policy intent and the genuine improved practice that is set on the values that we actually very commonly agree on. A lot of people in the state really appreciate and want to continue to press forward on an educational equity agenda. Many folks in the state recognize the value of local control, yet we have no clue how to define it or put anything on paper to say, this is my responsibility in a county office versus my responsibility in a district versus my responsibility in a state agency. So I think one important piece of background in terms of that sets the context for a lot of these findings is in the course of collecting these data, particularly from education administrators, we wanted to understand a little bit more about their mentality, mindset, behavioral cue. And one of the things that we asked about was rules, like how do they, as administrators, about 900, a little bit more over 900 of these individuals in the central office, from the superintendent down to administrative support staff in districts, SELPAs, county offices, and charter schools. And what we found on if you think about it as like a scale of 1 to 6, right? 1 being, I recognize the rule is there, but I'm gonna do whatever I need to accomplish the goal, versus on the other end, I'm always gonna follow the rule regardless. Like whatever it says on paper, black and white, that's the way I'm gonna follow the rule. So what we found for these administrators is that 90% of them were towards the stricter rule, right? So we have a way in our system today where administrators are already moving towards and wanting to follow the rules. As one of my colleagues said when I brought this up with her, she said, well, Jason, of course, because these are all the kids that got A's in school. So now they've just come into our profession because they're wanting to continue to follow those rules, which makes good sense. But the context is really, really important, particularly given the fact that when we talk about issues of compliance or other higher authorities setting rules for us, or at least the perception of setting those rules, the reaction that these administrators have is really different. So it's not that these individuals don't want to follow the rule. It's actually quite the opposite. They are really, really wanting to follow the rule, but the design of the system and way that we're trying to get to improvement is being crowded by the way that we're thinking about those system elements and system improvements. So one of the other interesting things that came out of the study too is somebody would ask, well, it's a very black and white issue. All administrators don't like compliance, so if it shows up, they don't want to do it, versus if it's not compliance, they're going to want to do it. And in fact, what we found was quite the opposite. When administrators saw value, and they do, a lot of administrators see value in various activities in compliance, when they see value in it, they actually spend more time doing it. Just let that sink in for a second. I see a compliance activity as an administrator in a system. I see that it's aligned to my values to support students, to drive my mission. I'm willing to spend more time on that compliance activity because I know it's doing something of benefit to students. It sends us a signal that something is broken between the way the state is setting out that initial policy, how it is being interpreted in regulation and rolled out to LEAs, and how it eventually shows up in LEAs in terms of the work itself. So we can always think about time on a linear scale, right? 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, so on and so forth. But we also would wondered about this notion of, is there anything else that is pulling on the time of these administrators that causes what we often hear is burnout, right? We've heard these stories over the last 5, maybe 10 years of people jumping out of the system a lot earlier than what they would. For a lot of my colleagues that are CBOs and CFOs, I beg them to stay. Just stay another year, stay another 2 years. And they're like, I am finished, I am done, this is it, I'm headed out. And what we were able to understand is that part of that work was associated with that rule abiding mindset. And in particular, that mindset contributed to kind of three things specifically. So one, really risk aversion, right? If I'm a rule follower, I want to avoid breaking a rule, right? So I'm going to do whatever I need to not break that rule and kind of stay inside of the guidelines. The second is the cognitive load, right? Just think about it. If I'm really anxious about making sure a rule was followed or that I submitted the paperwork appropriately, that builds over time, right? It's not a single moment, but it's that single moment amplified by 1,000 or 10,000 instances. And I think the last one is really around attention. They have this phenomenon in behavioral psychology called attentional residue. So if you are experiencing the first two things around risk aversion and cognitive load, the attention that you are able to submit or commit to a following activity is degraded because part of your mind is still back on the other activity, right? So imagine that anxiety or that fear that you have. This is part of the experience that administrators are having in addition to the just straight up amounts of time that they're spending on these types of activities. So you probably heard one of the kind of comments earlier today in terms of the amount of time that we found. This was a kind of population level estimate where it was essentially 20 hours per week that these individuals were spending on compliance. And I think it's really, really important to distinguish that part of that 20 hours is actually beneficial to our structure of government, right? We have to have some way to check on what is happening at lower levels of government. It's what we kind of define as governance supporting types of work. And so when we look at that split between both governance supporting and burdensome and frictional time, it's about a 40-60 split. So of the 20 hours, about 60% of that is time that we think we can find more efficiency and opportunity to kind of move through that work. The one thing that I just want to point out here is just the large numbers, right? Like massive amounts. We're talking about 151,000 hours per week statewide that administrators are spending on this work. And part of the value and opportunity is, again, finding that alignment between the way the state is thinking about what it needs and how LEAs can be using that information to keep driving the work that they're doing on a local level. We see some opportunity for this when you look at things like high school and post-secondary compliance activities, which was the only compliance bucket that had a positive net contributing value, right? So statewide, administrators are saying, hey, there's some stuff here that's actually contributing to forward progress in our state. Last thing I'll kind of offer up, and then I'll just jump to some of the suggestions from the research, is just to say that when we think about different activities that administrators can distinguish between those kinds of activities. That is to say that some of these activities they really recognize as not having any value at all, things like Public Records Act requests, but also with things like the LCAP, where they see both a value to it, but they also have been experiencing it as highly burdensome. So with that, I'll close and turn it back over to Julie.
All right. So the plan is we've got a little bit of time for panel discussion, and then we're going to have tables where you all can talk as well. And so let's make sure we have a little bit of time for conversation. So I wanted to ask the group a provocative question that Morgan helped me with, which is really, are we expecting too much from these tools? LCAP, dashboard. Should we perhaps think about other ways of getting to what we want, which is, right, ways of continuous improvement and accountability, and so thinking about LCAP, whether that's Jacob and Jason, dashboard, Morgan, or and any of the tools, are they, I kept hearing that they aren't necessarily serving their purpose as well. Should we be redesigning them? Should we change them? Like, are we just expecting too much? Maybe there are other ways that we should be thinking about this.
Okay. Yeah, I think we should redesign the LCAP every year and have a brand new template for county.
Yeah, great solution.
So the reason people giggled is because it points to a problem. I think the LCAP itself has the potential to be a fantastic tool. so much information that so many different audiences care a great deal about is contained in this annually produced document. What Jason's work and the work of others have pointed out is that the process is where things start to break down. The continually kind of, and Eos made this point too, continually like piling on demands, things like changing the template and having to relearn it, all these kind of get in the way of the LCAP sort of fulfilling its intended purpose, sort of living up to the promise. Not necessarily something I think we should abandon, but certainly room for improvement, I would say.
And specifics, what would we improve?
It doesn't quite need to be as long and elaborate as it is. I think this comes from some of the qualitative work. I think that people who have filled out LCAPs before in the room can speak more to this than me, but I think that there's a sense that a lot of work goes into producing them and no one ever reads them, and there's not a whole lot of meaningful feedback or sort of stakes involved. And so that kind of undermines the sort of motivation to take it sort of seriously. The public engagement piece of the LCAP is also a major challenge, finding ways to meaningfully engage with parents and community members in a way that would sort of fulfill the mission of LCFF and have the theory of action link up to the process in a meaningful way is an important barrier.
Great.
And I don't know how to fix that one.
Okay,
quickly.
thank you. Morgan, or no, go for it, Jason.
A great kind of opening by Jacob, and I would say that I think the tools are part of the issue, but not the entirety of it. I think the tools represent the state's desire or ability of wanting to know and have safety or security in knowing that those resources are being spent well. But I think it's gone too far. I mean, I think that's what our research shows. I think, the work that's coming out of what Jacob said was going too far. And I think at the end of the day, ultimately, if you boil it down, it's about trust. Like, does the state, do other intermediary organizations trust that LEAs are going to use those resources in a way to pursue the common goals that we have? And I think we've seen instances over the course of the last decade that would suggest that that is happening, but also instances where that's not happening. And in those instances where it wasn't happening, there's almost like a whiplash to the system, right? The system wants to ask more, produce more, create more data as a product of wanting to be able to prove that the things that are actually happening on the LA are happening. And I think the harder part of this is when you think about genuine improvement in systems, that kind of thing is really, really hard to just put in a report or file a piece of data. And I think that's where the work is what are the types of activities in which state leaders, counties, and LEAs can come together to have that confidence to be able to see it themselves and then share it externally with others.
Great.
I would just say that, so I'm going to speak mainly about the public accountability stuff. I mean, I think that at a high level, I think it's clear that parents and other groups want access to evidence on how schools are doing, right? I think people make choices about, clearly we know that school quality matters because, for instance, neighborhood catchment zones play an enormous role in affecting housing prices. So people clearly think about school quality, and they want evidence on that. That's why great schools exist. What I think I guess I would say, I think that from the public accountability perspective, the state, the state if the state's going to put out a tool like this that's going to enable parents to make choices or evaluations of potential schools for their kid or how their kid's doing, these tools are just not good for that purpose because they just don't really, they're not interpretable by the large majority of potential users, and they also don't answer the specific kinds of questions that people are likely to have, such as, how does this school compare to that school, which I think is a main question that a parent's going to want to have. That said, I also think we should be really, really clear that the evidence that public accountability report cards, drive school improvement is very non-existent. And that theory is more or less totally debunked. It still can serve a purpose for individuals, but I think, beyond improving the report cards, then the state also should be doing things like identifying schools that need additional support and intervention and actually intervening in them, doing the kinds of other things that we are in all the other papers that are in Getting Down to Facts, like my other paper, which is on curriculum materials, which is putting a thumb on the scale to ensure that all kids have access to high quality curriculum materials and teachers who are supported to use them, and those kinds of things, which are more direct forms of accountability and state involvement.
Great, thank you. I'm going to raise the topic of capacity, which seemed to come up across the papers. It's kind of a common theme, and maybe EOS, you want to get in here too. But where is the greatest need, do we think, for district and county leaders? Whether, and all of you, I guess, could respond, whether it's in response to these tools, but to engage in the kind of continuous improvement, kinds of the activities that, Jason, you were describing, and also how do we address like the variation in capacity that exists? I know that came out of your paper, EOS. So what are some suggestions on what the state could be doing in the near term and in the long term?
So one of the things that I heard from the different interviews was that it's less about one-off professional development and consistent either coaching or some form of consistent communication that happens between county offices and the districts and the schools. So having that sense of consistency rather than one-off yearly events, that's one way that we've seen could be supporting people on the ground. So I'll start with that. Maybe others also have highlights on capacity.
Anyone else want to respond? Jason, you want
to? Just to be specific, because I think we've all got our definition of capacity. It's like one of those terms we have in education where everyone says they're doing it, and then when you really get down to it, it's all a different definition. So my definition here in terms of capacity is thinking about how individuals in different levels of the education system are able to perform the role of whatever role they have as accountability or support. And I think in this way, we're in a situation where sometimes we don't realize the water that we're swimming in. And often what I have seen with counties and with school districts is that these individuals, even when given the opportunity to, for example, improve their capacity in genuine continuous improvement activities with a set of districts, et cetera, there is a reversion to the mean, right? I think this is exactly to EOS's point. We are so far into the hole in terms of people being incentivized, having a mindset, and being behaviorally cued to wanting to stick to the rule, that it's hard for them to kind of move in the other direction. So I think just to double down on what EOS is saying in terms of investments, those investments not only would have to be consistent, but we would have to be laser focused on them being genuinely different than the way that we have rolled out those resources before to get more into a place where we're actually seeing improvements in the systems versus going right back to filing a report or submitting a piece of data.
Okay, I'm doing wait time if anyone else on the panel. My final thing is thinking about, are there structural barriers, right? So Jason, I know in your paper you talked about like special ed is, we often sort of put the onus on folks in districts and schools and in counties to be doing this work, but there are things that are getting in the way potentially of them, whether that's the burdens, but there are other things that maybe the state could be doing that would allow for the kinds of continuous improvement we want that has nothing to do with individual motivation to do this work or their ability to do this work. So are there other structural impediments that we should be thinking about?
Well, again, it comes maybe more from my other paper on curriculum, but I would just say that, using that as an example, right? The state could be more actively involved in identifying high-quality materials and supporting districts to adopt them and use them, and that I think would have a few benefits, which is offloading a tremendous amount of work that goes on in districts that they're really not well prepared to do, to evaluate materials. And the state just approved 40-some math materials, and that's just not really helpful from the standpoint of getting materials adopted, but it's also incredibly burdensome. And there's this perception, I think, that, not being too prescriptive on that particular issue is empowering, right? That it's empowering to local educators to let them make these choices. But actually offering so little guidance is in fact profoundly disempowering, and I think gets in the way of them being able to free up their time to do more important things like continuously improving their instruction and thinking about data and what's working and what's not working. So that's one example that I would say.
I'd like to just say that what Morgan was saying is really important here, and maybe a little history lesson. When did we have county superintendents? When did we start having county superintendents? It was actually enshrined in the 1879 Constitution, and the reason we have it is really for supervision. And this idea of, yes, we want local control, but also guidance that needs to be there. And so this supervision that happened, and with the county office, we've added more and more things for them. And so that has, you can say, become a barrier or a challenge for county offices, especially as you have variations in county offices. As I mentioned, you have Alpine with 500 students, and you have LA County with more than 1 million students. And so understanding how the variations in these counties can also affect their capacity, as we were talking about earlier. And so I think highlighting that and maybe trying to find solutions based off of those facts that we have currently.
Jake.
Yeah, it's probably predictable that if we have a sort of blanket policy that we expect all LEAs to follow, that's sort of consistent, applies the same expectations to every school district, every county office, that ignores the wide variation in capacity and staffing, is bound to create inequities and pretty large variation in the sort of quality of oversight and fidelity to policy. In some other analysis I've done, not in the Getting Down to Facts report, but looking at the increased and improved services for unduplicated pupils section of the LCAP, how districts are spending their supplemental and concentration grant funds. One of the strongest associations is between the sort of length and elaboration of those descriptions and the number of district office staff employed in the district. Not necessarily the amount of funds that the districts are getting or the number of unduplicated pupils, it's the number of people who are available to do the work. The state arguably should do more to recognize and support districts that are stretched thin if we're going to hold them accountable or expect them to produce high quality, meaningful reporting.
Great. Yeah, last word, yep.
So just to echo some of what my colleagues have already said, and split this into kind of two buckets, kind of in the short term versus long term, right, around structural issues. So in the short term, there's an immense amount of siloing. When you think about a bill that comes through, or even in trailer bill, nobody's checking to even ask a basic question like downstream, like what kind of duplication or layering is this going to result in? And I think that's a fairly easier one. I know there's some ledge staff in the room that would maybe argue otherwise with me, but that's more in the short term, right? I think in the long term, this is the much harder part of the puzzle, is that the state has to get clear with itself, even if it's for 5, 6, or 7 years. Like, what do we want? It seems like we want everything right now in public ed, and I can appreciate that, knowing some of the students that I interact with. And I also think there's something to be said about coherence and clarity and sticking to, even if it's 2 or 3 really clear goals, that would allow for 2 things for LEAs, in my opinion. The first is some level of predictability around policy and funding that's coming down from Sacramento. So they could at least incorporate that into the things that they're already doing. And second, that the funding that we are receiving, which everybody in this room probably sees as being one of the most volatile in the country, we got to make some hard choices, right? So when we see that giant 10 or $15 billion surplus, what's the discipline to set it aside or to put it on a level of spend across districts that's 7, 8, 9, and 10 years, right? Like I prefer to have stability in funding rather than a huge spike in dollars for 2 or 3 years. And those kinds of conversations are very, very difficult because they fly in the face of a lot of our kind of political whims sometimes.
Great. Thank you. Okay. We have been talking at you for a very long time. So we'd like to have a little bit of time right now to have a table discussion. So we've put up some possible questions to discuss. What stood out to you in the research related to accountability and system alignment, the balance of state and local decision making, and system capacity to implement and sustain reforms? What barriers do you see standing in the way of necessary reform in this area? And based on this research, what do you think should be the top priorities for the next administration and legislature? And we're going to have about 20 minutes to have that conversation, and then we'll come back and we're going to take a poll.